Okay, Lisa. Okay, here we go. Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's bi-weekly podcast of hot news out of the region. The world's first transitioning away from fossils fuel conference, co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands, convened in Santa Marta, Colombia, April 24 through 29, with 59 countries participating. It was a breakaway conference from the annual COP Climate Summit, a response to ongoing failures to reach global agreement to phase out fossil fuels. Last year in Brazil, frustrated at the lack of progress at COP 30, where negotiations were stymied by petrostates and their allies, Colombia proposed forging a coalition of the willing to discuss the details of what a transition away from fossil fuels would look like. Joining today's episode to discuss the results of this inaugural conference is my friend and CODEPINK colleague, Aaron Kirschenbaum. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks so much for having me.
Aaron is CODEPINK's War is Not Green campaigner and East Coast regional organizer. He is based and originally from Brooklyn and holds an MA in community development and planning from Clark University. He also holds a BA in human environmental and urban economic geography from Clark. During the time in school, Aaron worked on international climate justice organizing and educational program development, and he's got a much more extensive biography than that as well, which I will put a link to it in the episode description below. So welcome, Aaron. I'm so happy to be working with you.
Yeah, no, so it's a long time coming and really glad to be here.
This is the perfect intersection of our work.
Exactly.
So for the audience, let's give them a brief description of what COP is, and then talk about why the Santa Marta conference was needed and organized, specifically by Colombia. Netherlands too, but.
Yes, no, exactly. So COP stands for the Conference of Parties, and it's the annual session where countries meet to review agreements and progress in supposedly combating the climate crisis. It's been around for this year, 30 years, and has been something that's been pretty defunct from the start in many ways. CODEPINK has been calling out routinely the lack of military emissions that are accounted for in COP, which started at COP 3 during the Kyoto Protocol, which, thanks to US lobbying, exempted military emissions from reporting. And so that's been a huge issue from the start. Every year there's various issues that emerge more and more. There is the notable factor of US of fossil fuel lobbyists at the conference, where at this previous year, around 1 in 25 people there were linked to the fossil fuel economy, which, and the other factor is that there is consensus used for the actual process. So it's also just been a very slow-moving process. Countries there, often the global north countries dictate the direction of it. Most global north countries have relied on fossil fuels for their economy and extraction for their economy. And so the conference itself has struggled to rid itself of the extraction and capitalism undergirding a lot of the major countries present there. And so for years there's been dissatisfaction. There's been extraordinary movement outside of COP around people summits and protests, but some of that has been something that has really struggled to get into the actual conference itself. And this past year in Belém in Brazil, where it was held, I think there was the contradictions were at its highest in many ways. It was in the Amazon rainforest, but there was enormous environmental destruction and deforestation created in order to actually to maintain it. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon struggled to actually have representation in it. And the final documents and agreements of COP didn't actually mention fossil fuels in it to begin with. And so
Wow.
the conference in many ways has become more something around like if fossil fuel transition is needed rather than how to make it happen, which is sort of the launch of where we are now with the transition away from fossil fuels conference in Colombia, which was officially announced at the end of COP in Brazil. And the conference itself invited a number of different folks to it. It's a coalition of the willing, and that meant that a lot of the signatories of the Belém Declaration that led to this were invited. There were also a few other constituencies, members of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, members of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, members of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, and a few other countries and organizations and were invited, along with there were around 1,000 different organizations present there that represented different NGOs, people's movements, social movements, and different stakeholder constituencies. And it was hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands. Colombia specifically being a high fossil fuel producer in the past, but also has made notable steps towards moving away from fossil fuels as well. And
Well,
I'll
and they have a
stop there for now.
president who so believes in humanity.
Right.
Yeah. And
For
sees
sure.
the destruction of extraction. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned that, in Belém that there was no solution as far as the global north, those countries that consume the extracted energy. Let's talk about that paradigm that they're the consumers in the global north and the extractions happening in the global south. And some of that extraction has to do with debt payment.
Yes. So the countries in the global north, particularly the US, is one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels. A large part of that has to do um, with US military emissions. The US military is the number one institutional polluter in the world. We have 800 bases across the world in 80 countries, every continent on the planet, that all contribute to this through the production of fossil fuels, of weapons, of transfers, and overall, US-led corporations make it one of the largest producers of fossil fuel on the planet. And other global north countries share this, particularly a lot of NATO countries. But of course, it's countries in the global south that have paid the price the most, with US-led coups, invasions, underdevelopment, and debt traps that have destroyed the economies and infrastructure of a lot of these countries. And so that was a key uh, aspect of what was discussed in the context of COP, particularly when thinking about major barriers to transition. Uh, in a lot of the context of the discussions here, we're talking about the ways in which what major barriers are. And one of the things is global governance and the ability for countries to actually have sovereignty over their oil and their energy infrastructure in order to actually make any transition. And so, I mean, there the climate debt is something that I think has been brought up over and over again. That's why climate finance has been a big part of discussion, the idea of transferring wealth from countries in the global north to countries in the global south. And that can go in a number of different directions, and there's a lot of different debates on how to do that. But climate finance is a routine discussion in terms of the ways that countries in the global south can develop green energy infrastructure to begin with, but you can't do that when there's immense amount of debt.
So in the global south with their debt burden, they increase their extraction industries for export to help pay down the debt. Yeah,
Exactly.
so it's that north-south global debt trap that, wow.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that is a crucial piece of discussion is where the blame is to put it. I mean, you have countries also in Latin America, of course, like Venezuela, that have been under devastating economic sanctions for decades and have had to rely on oil production and exports in order to survive and meet their economies. And so you can't start transitioning away from fossil fuels if you don't have the wealth and sovereignty over that energy infrastructure and finances in order to begin that.
You know, I remember this is not directly related, well, it's environmentally related. It's not directly related to Santa Marta, but I remember when Rafael Correa was president in Ecuador and people, particularly environmentalists in the global north, were really annoyed with him for continuing the oil extraction industry in Ecuador. And he was very clear. He's like, we can't just switch from one form of economy to another overnight just because now one day I'm out of office and now today I'm in office and it's all going to change. But what he did do was break that really rigid neo-colonial structure and kept the profits at home to invest in infrastructure and other social projects. And he also, and I'm sure you know, he also started that international trust, I believe, to keep the oil in the ground. And, you know, it was a great idea, but like the global north did not buy into that at all. Yeah. So there have been ideas, but it just is it's so hard to break that, and that's a whole another conversation of its own. It's so hard to break that global north neoliberal neo-colonial model. It's like
Exactly.
500-year-old model. I speak of that sitting here in Mexico City. So,
Right.
yeah, it's a 500-year-old model. You know, different forms of natural resources, but all done for extraction.
Absolutely.
And then everything gets extracted, sent overseas for refinement, and then the countries that the oil is sitting under have to import the finished products.
Right.
So it's a horrible cycle. So what, you mentioned the US military being the largest footprint on the planet. Let's talk about that specifically, because that's directly tied to your work and CODEPINK's War is Not Green campaign. But this is something that we just don't talk about. I mean, CODEPINK does, and you do. Yeah. But as a country, as an issue, the U.S. military is always kind of the elephant in the room, right? That
Yes,
doesn't
exactly.
get overtly called out. So let's talk about that.
Yes. So the US military, as you said, is the largest institutional polluter in the world. But even that number is just if you are talking about the consumption of oil, of barrels of oil by the US military. What it does not include is the environmental cost of oil burn pits in wars, of creating hospitals in wars and the rebuilding after wars. It doesn't account for the supply chains of production of weapons from weapons manufacturers. It doesn't account for NATO countries that have significantly contributed to the environmental degradation of the entire world. And it also fails to take into account the training exercises that the U.S. does, like RIMPAC in the Pacific, is a huge part of this. That includes a lot of other countries that are perpetuating the issue as well. But that figure it also sits alongside the U.S. This is over 800 based in 80 countries. Like I said, each one is their own devastating story of of expulsion over land, of destruction of land, of deforestation, of removal of peoples. And the actual figure and a lot of this information didn't come out until COP26
Mhm.
around 2020. Well, it actually came out in 2017, but it was brought to COP in 2020. And I think the notion that the US military and that war is incredibly environmentally destructive is something that anyone who's sort of been paying attention to wars and environmental destruction for decades can know. Code Pink was started in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And folks who started Code Pink were there and we're seeing the birth defects, the farmers that were unable to sustain their crops and agriculture. Today, there are children whose hair samples have titanium in them from the millions of bullets that have been that were fired in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the actual figures didn't come out until Netta Crawford in 2017 put out through the Cost of War Project this report that was talking about US military figures. And it's something that when that report came out, it was able to be included in a lot more um, reports. We brought it to COP, but it's something that hasn't really been touched upon by a lot of environmental spaces. But it is something that folks on the front lines have always known. I think you can look at examples like Vieques in Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
which was a U.S. naval facility for around 5 decades, with with bombs dropping that were often would be tested in Vieques and later dropped in places like Palestine, and hundreds of tons of depleted uranium, mercury, all of that, leading to extremely elevated cancer rates on the island. And that's still something that is there. Uh, in Palestine, I think many of us have seen the genocide and ecocide that's taken place in Gaza, which has amounted to the emissions of more than 100 countries combined, totals from the war on terror, quote unquote, which we know to be for oil, uh, from 2001 to 2017, um, released roughly, I think it's, um, I have the statistic, but yeah, millions of metric tons of emissions. And so the component about US military and warfare that I think is one of the most important things to understand in, um, in a context like the Santa Marta conference, is that the US military is not just one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels, but it is also the enforcement mechanism for the fossil fuel industry. And you can't have a transition away from fossil fuels when the US military will bomb Iran with the third largest oil reserves, kidnap the sovereign president, the sitting president of a country for oil, or set up bases in countries around the world to keep them in check. Uh, and you can't have a transition away from fossil fuels when all of that still exists. And so I think that was an issue that was consistently touched upon in a lot of the processes leading up to the conference and in some of the outputs of the People's Summit part of the conference as well.
So tell us very briefly, and I'm going to put the link to the Code Pink War is Not Green campaign in the episode description, but just tell us very briefly what it is.
So the War is Not Green campaign is a campaign that takes from everything that I just said and works to bridge the gap between environmental organizing and organizing against war, militarism, and imperialism. And it specifically tries to reach out within environmental spaces, acknowledging, like you said, that war is often the elephant in the room, so to speak,
Yeah.
in climate spaces, increasingly less so, which we can get to in a little bit. But to bridge the gap, to educate on the underlying extractive roots of climate and environmental destruction and war and imperialism, and build a larger movement that recognizes that we shouldn't even really be having labels like environmental movement, anti-war movement, but our greatest collective threats are militarism, imperialism, capitalism that undergirds all of it. And we have the same targets and can build a larger movement for the people on the planet.
Great. Okay, and for the audience, the link will be in that to Aaron's campaign. I'll put the link in the episode description, and you can reach out to him to learn more and participate. Let's talk about, well, I want to talk about some of the conference results, but before we do that, let's specifically talk about the People Summit and Conference that was held in conjunction with the transitioning from fossil fuels.
Yes, so the People's Summit, the full name of which was the People's Summit for the transition away for fossil fuels, for a fossil fuel-free future, the People's Summit for a fossil-free future. And it was essentially the civil society counterpart to the official conference. And so this came from a long process in conversation with the Colombian government throughout in the planning of it, and was made up of a lot of different factors. There was NGOs and social movements. There was constituencies like Afro-descendants, Indigenous peoples, women and gender diversities, and social movements, NGOs. And it throughout its process sort of had different relationships to the summit itself, and in its final process ended up being oh, I froze. Can you still see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you froze for just a second.
Okay.
Okay, you're back.
The conference went through a lot of different things. Okay, cool. The conference went through a lot of different phases itself, but wait, am I freezing again?
Yeah.
Okay, wait, let me see what I can do. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
I might have a little too much open right now.
You're moving just fine. Well,
Okay.
you want to try it without the video?
I'm trying to close some windows.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned, I'm just going to say this, well, you mentioned some of the participants in the People Summit were Indigenous communities, and I want us to go back and expand on that because that is a highly vulnerable demographic in Colombia and across the global south, global north too.
Okay, I think, is it better now?
Yeah, here you are. Okay.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll just say, yeah, the People's Summit itself was a space where civil society was collectively trying to chart the course towards the transition away from fossil fuels. It was a space where I think we were able to break down a lot of what can be taboo in larger spaces and really come to an incredible collective declaration that was released, and I think will continue to be developed in the next several months. And the People's Declaration, I think, is definitely something to share and to talk about more, as it situated the entire context of the summit and of the conference in a context of U.S.-Israeli imperialism and expansion, of genocide in Gaza, of attacks on Iran in a way that's completely changing the landscape around fossil fuels and war, of attacks on Lebanon and Venezuela, the blockade of Cuba. All of this was mentioned, and the necessity of undoing capitalism, colonialism, imperialism are all foregrounded in the language of these 1,000 organizations that came together to push the civil society page of what people at the front lines are really experiencing and what is really needed. And I think it was incredible that this space was able to be convened, and it
Yeah.
was not without its issues. The entire conference was not without its issues. Um, I'll particularly mention that in the conference itself, there was a lot of issues around the visas, and particularly from people from the African continent. But the space itself, I think, was something that was able to develop a platform that I think everyone in the climate movement in the global north needs to be looking towards, because it represents actual the people at the front lines of militarism and ecocide globally.
Let's talk briefly about one specific demographic, and I mention this because of our work throughout the global south and me specifically here in Latin America. How you mentioned, demographics, communities who are on the front lines, and that here in Latin America, we very clearly see indigenous communities. To me, they are like the vanguard of humanity, kind of like the bees of humans, and so many of them live among and on top of natural resources, fossil fuels specifically, but others as well. And they're highly vulnerable, and not just in the global south, but in the global north too.
Yes. I think indigenous peoples have always seen the first impacts of climate catastrophe and imperialism. The very notion of extraction is something that comes in with colonization, and in the context of the U.S. or Turtle Island, the indigenous peoples have always been on the front lines and continue to be extracted from. Especially now, we're seeing data centers being built around the country. A lot of that mining is happening in indigenous territories and land. And a lot of the data centers themselves are being pushed there because there's a uh, complete throwing away of any degree of sovereignty and any degree of self-determination for indigenous peoples. And of course, around the world, in the global south, indigenous land has been what's been mined, what's been deforested, and well, indigenous people themselves protect extraordinary amounts of biodiversity and land. And so indigenous representation in COP has been something that has been consistently thrown away and disrespected. I can't speak, of course, to the to the final sort of outcomes the of indigenous representation in the context of this conference because I wasn't there. But I will say that within the People's Summit itself, there's extraordinary attention put in the final declaration itself to protecting indigenous land, respecting territorial rights, sovereignty, self-determination, and understanding indigenous knowledge in protecting the land, and creating systems of that are non-extractive, are regenerative, and prioritize land sovereignty and self-determination for indigenous peoples.
You have mentioned the word sovereignty a number of times in our conversation, and I think it's really important for our audience to understand that sovereignty applies to nations, communities of people, different demographics, but there's also a term that we use called natural resource sovereignty, and that puts a whole nother spin on when you look at what's sitting underneath a country, because in the global north, specifically in the States, we're so keen to say, oh, excuse me, Venezuela, but you're sitting on our oil. And that's that 500 years of colonialism from the global north to the south. But that's such a key phrase for me, is like the natural resource sovereignty, and it is as important as national sovereignty or demographic sovereignty.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about some of the results of the actual Santa Marta conference, the transitioning away from fossil fuels. One of the things that I saw and I found interesting was France's proposal. France, an actual European global north country, was there because so many global north countries were not, as you mentioned earlier. That they had, that France had put forth removing coal and phasing out of fossil gas. I don't think they mentioned petroleum, but coal and gas, and that was fascinating to me. Is that a big deal, or was that sort of an olive branch in the?
I think it's definitely significant. And any country that was there, I think was a large step in terms of getting over the hump that COP has had around phasing out fossil fuels to begin with. And I haven't gotten a chance to look through France's plan in depth. But I think that it is fairly significant that France is one of the countries that is moving towards um, any degree of a fossil fuel phase out, and I think that's something that can hopefully be continued and pushed upon in the context of the second conference, which we can talk about in
Yeah.
a little bit. But I think it's also very important to mention France as well as the Netherlands, which was one of the co-hosts, is still a member of NATO, and that's not something that can be left off the hook. NATO is, of course,
So that's
essentially,
the military tie for them.
yes,
Yeah.
is of course still a major, one of the largest sources of pollution in the world. And so I think if France isn't considering the military emissions that it continues, the ways that its neocolonialism continues throughout Africa and the extraction of resources, and the its contributions to forces like NATO. I think that there's a long way to go for them, but it is for sure a notable step and something that can hopefully be pushed even farther.
So what else should we talk about in
Yeah.
closing? There's a second conference coming up.
Yes, the second conference coming up is going to be next year in Tuvalu, co-hosted with Ireland.
Oh.
And I think the important outcomes sort of to think about here is that this conference was never a negotiating space. It was a space to create a roadmap and plant the seeds to move even further. And that is an important distinction from COP, which is an explicit negotiating space. And there is a lot of conversation around the ways that moving forward, different countries will be developing their plans in coordination with COP, but and the UN process. But this is a space that can hopefully move farther and outside of it and actually get to the goal of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, as in an agreement, a diplomatic agreement for countries to collectively work together to phase out fossil fuels. And of course, that needs to happen with demilitarization at its core and anti-colonialism at its core. And so I think this was an important step, and the conference has uh, launched a new direction for the phase out of fossil fuels. There were a number of countries that voiced strong support for a fossil fuel treaty. Uh, Gustavo Petro, in his closing remarks, mentioned also capitalism at the core of all of this.
Yeah.
And I think the context of the conference itself, you couldn't avoid U.S.-Israeli warfare in Iran. You couldn't avoid the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. And so this was a place where that was not something that was able to be avoided. I think what folks really need to look towards is the People's Declaration, and I think civil society will continue to push it forward and ensure that in the next conference and the lead up to it, uh, the key demands that it instates isn't something that's able to be avoided. The declaration itself had four demands. It called for a complete and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, aligned with meeting the goal of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius and reach global zero emissions by 2050, a rapid, direct, equitable, and just transition to 100% renewable energy, an end to barriers to the transition, which includes militarism and warfare and imperialism, and a comprehensive just transition. There's also 15 principles that includes a focus on people-centered human rights. It includes sovereignty, peace, and global justice, understanding decarbonization, its connection to demilitarization, asserting wars and militarism are a major driver of emissions and a barrier to justice, reparative and transformative justice, and complete system change. And the entire context is situated within the current imperial aggression that we see. And so that I think is an extremely important thing that all of us within the global north need to be looking towards, because it really just does tell us that the fossil fuel economy cannot continue in its current state. Well, if US imperialism uh, is brought down, and while US imperialism remains supreme with as the enforcement mechanism of fossil fuels, and of all extraction,
Yeah.
the climate crisis will continue. And so I also think an important piece that I haven't mentioned as much yet is the continued extraction of critical minerals. And when thinking about indigenous peoples, I think that was a point that was consistently brought up, in that, there's a so-called green transition that we're moving towards,
Right.
which is incredibly important. But you have still in Latin America, you have the lithium triangle, that has been a large part of US motivation of regime change in the region. In the Congo has been an extreme amount of there's been a genocide happening for the past several decades, for the sake of extracting cobalt, and other critical minerals, so-called critical minerals. And
All the high-tech minerals.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so while we're moving towards um, uh, a fossil fuel phase out, one of the key points that was consistently brought up throughout the entire process, the written submissions, the discussion amongst countries, the final People's Declaration, it was continuously expressed that we need to avoid extraction in any form moving forward, and that militarism is a key part of that.
So, oh gosh, it's encouraging and it's disappointing. It's all in one. So you're so great at this work, Erin, and your field so well. It's just really, so beneficial to talk with you today. In our closing minutes, can you just remind us where the next transitioning away from fossil fuels conference is going to be, and possibly how some of our audience and some of the War is Not Green people can participate?
Yes. So the next one is going to be in Tuvalu, in the Pacific. I People can find out more about that at transitionawayconference.com.
Okay,
Um,
I'll put that link
and
in the description too.
and they can also learn more about the civil society component and the next steps for the People's Declaration, at fossilfuelrising.org. Folks can continue to plug in with CodePink's work around it at codepink.org/wing. We also have bi-weekly uh, working group calls, at codepink.org/wing sign up. And those are places where we'll continue to be thinking through how to coordinate with other organizations, how to coordinate uh, with different people's movements around the world, and how to continue trying to engage in this space, which I think it the whole I'll just say that, like, the work of Code Pink's War is Not Green campaign has been a struggle for a long time.
Since our founding and before, and I think we lost you. Okay.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Oh
all
yeah,
right.
I'll just close with the work of Code Pink's War is Not Green campaign has been a struggle for a long time to really bring a lot of this front and center. But this was a moment where in civil society it was completely clear what needed to be said. And I think that's something that
Great.
will continue, I think, as the contradictions heighten, but also as there is more unity in these spaces, and the more that we have declarations to look to, and like this, and the more that there can actually be real steps to coordinate to bring a holistic analysis to these internationalist spaces where the most some of where which local work can draw from.
Wow. I'm so thankful for you and your work and your knowledge. Yeah. So I'll be sure for the audience, I will put all the links that Erin's mentioned in our conversation. I'll put those in the episode description. And I hope, Erin, that you and I can have another conversation when the second Transitioning Away for Fossil Fuels conference occurs, and maybe even before that.
Yes.
So, what a pleasure to work with you on this episode.
No, really appreciate it.
I'm so thankful for your time. And so for the audience, thanks for tuning in today. And you can catch us in 2 weeks on CODEPINK's What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean. We will see you then.
Thanks so much.